Sometimes the hardest thing in life is watching someone you love go hungry when there's nothing left to give. Sarah Brennan knew that pain every single day, splitting her last scraps of bread with her frail mother while winter closed in around their isolated Wyoming cabin. It was 1887. Her husband lay 6 months in the ground, and survival had become a prayer she whispered into the frozen wind. The nearest town was 2 days away through country that showed no mercy to the desperate or the weak. She'd made peace with how this story would end. Then a lonely mountain man named Nathaniel Cord rode up to her door with a pack mule and a lifetime of solitude weighing on his shoulders. What he saw that afternoon changed everything. Could one stranger's compassion rewrite both their fates? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's fingers had gone numb again. She flexed them slowly, trying to work, feeling back into the joints as she knelt beside the cold stove. The last of the kindling sat in a pitiful pile beside her, enough for maybe 2 more fires if she was careful. After that, she'd have to venture out to the wood pile Thomas had cut last autumn, now buried somewhere beneath 3 feet of snow. Thomas. Even his name brought an ache that had nothing to do with the cold. She reached up and touched the simple gold band that hung from a thin chain around her neck. His wedding ring. She'd slipped it off his finger the day they buried him, unable to leave it in the ground with him. It felt wrong, somehow, letting that symbol of their promises disappear into the earth. The ring was warm against her skin, heated by her own body, and she held it for a moment before tucking it back beneath her worn dress. They'd been so full of hope when they left Missouri 3 years ago. Thomas had been a carpenter by trade, a good one, with steady hands and an eye for detail that made his work sought after. But he dreamed bigger than a workshop in town. He'd heard the stories about Wyoming territory, about land available for homesteading, about the chance to build something that would belong to them and their children. Sarah's mother, Martha, had been against it from the start. She'd stood in their small parlor in Independence, her hands twisted in her apron, and begged them to reconsider. The frontier was no place for a young woman, she'd said. No place for the grandchildren she hoped would come. But Thomas had been persuasive, painting pictures with his words the way he shaped wood with his hands. He'd promised Martha her own room in the house he'd build. He'd promised Sarah a garden that would flourish in the mountain soil. He'd promised them both a future. Martha had come with them in the end. Her husband had passed 2 years before, and she had no other family to speak of. The 3 of them had made the journey in a covered wagon loaded with tools and supplies, with hope and determination, joining a train of other families heading west to start anew. The land they'd claimed sat in a valley along Crazy Woman Creek, sheltered on 3 sides by pine-covered ridges. Thomas had chosen it for the protection those ridges offered from the worst of the winter winds, for the water that ran clear and cold even in the driest months, for the rich soil visible where the creek had cut through the earth. He'd been right about all of it. The location was as close to perfect as the frontier offered. They had spent that first summer building the cabin. Thomas had felled the trees himself, stripped and notched each log with a precision that spoke to his craftsman's pride. The cabin was solid, tight-chinked against the weather, with real glass windows Thomas had hauled all the way from the last settlement. 2 rooms, a main room with a stove and table, and a smaller bedroom where Martha could have her privacy. Sarah and Thomas had slept in a loft Thomas had built into the rafters, climbing up each night to their nest beneath the peaked roof. It had been a good summer. Hard work, certainly, but the kind of work that feels purposeful, the kind that builds something lasting. Martha had planted a garden while Thomas worked on the cabin, coaxing vegetables from the soil despite the short growing season. They'd met a few neighbors, other homesteaders scattered across the valley, families like themselves looking to carve out a piece of the future. There'd been barn raisings and shared meals, the beginning of community in that wild place. Sarah had been happy, truly happy. She'd wake before dawn to Thomas's arm around her waist, to the sound of birds calling in the pines, to the smell of coffee her mother had already started brewing below. She'd felt rich beyond measure, though they had almost nothing by the world's standards. Then came the autumn, and with it, the first tests of their resolve. The growing season ended abruptly with an early frost that killed half of what they'd planted. Thomas had managed to find work helping neighbors with their building projects, trading his skills for supplies they'd need to get through winter. He'd been gone for days at a time, coming home exhausted but satisfied, his wages measured in sacks of flour and dried beans, in salt pork and coffee. Winter had arrived in November, with a fury that shocked even the old-timers. The snow fell heavy and constant, piling up against the cabin walls, covering the stumps in the clearing where Thomas had felled trees. They'd been prepared, or so they thought. The cabin was tight and warm. They had food stored. Thomas had cut wood enough to last until spring, but they hadn't prepared for sickness. Thomas had ridden to town in early March when the weather broke long enough to make the journey. They'd needed salt and flour, and Martha's cough had grown worse despite Sarah's nursing. He'd promised to bring back medicine, to find a doctor if he could convince one to make the journey out to their homestead. He'd come home 3 days later, feverish and delirious. He'd caught pneumonia somewhere on the trail, in some town or way station, and by the time he reached their cabin, he was barely able to stay in the saddle. Sarah had put him to bed immediately, had done everything she knew to break the fever. She'd made poultices and teas, had stayed awake for 3 days straight, bathing his forehead with cool water, praying to God to spare him. God had not answered that prayer. Thomas died on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was coming up over the eastern ridge. Sarah had been holding his hand, and she'd felt the exact moment his spirit left. One breath, then nothing. A stillness that was more than just the absence of breathing. An emptiness that filled the room like flood water. They'd buried him in a grove of aspens 100 yards from the cabin. Sarah and Martha had dug the grave themselves, taking turns with Thomas's shovel, the ground still half frozen and resistant. It had taken them most of a day. They'd wrapped him in their best quilt and lowered him down, and Sarah had said words over him that she barely remembered afterward. She'd placed wild flowers on the turned earth, though it was too early in the season and she'd had to search the south-facing slopes to find anything blooming. That had been 6 months ago. April had passed, then May, then the summer months. Sarah had tried to keep up with the work Thomas had done. She'd tended the garden, though it was too much for one person, and half of it went to weeds. She'd hunted when she could, though she was only a fair shot with Thomas's rifle. She'd set snares for rabbits and had gotten lucky more often than not, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. The rifle needed powder and shot she couldn't afford. The garden produced, but not abundantly, not enough to preserve for a long winter, and Martha's health had continued to decline. The cough Thomas had worried about had settled deep in her lungs. She tired easily, spending most of her days in bed, and Sarah had gradually taken on all the work of running the homestead. By October, when the first snows came again, Sarah knew they were in trouble. Real trouble, the kind that didn't have easy answers. She'd made one trip to town, riding Thomas's horse through an early storm, trying to trade what little she had for the supplies they'd need. But prices were high, and her goods brought less than she'd hoped. She'd come home with some flour, a little salt, not much else. That's when she'd started rationing, cutting their meals in half, then in half again, making soup from bones she'd already boiled twice, stretching every bite as far as it would go. She'd given Martha the larger portions without telling her, claiming she'd already eaten, lying with a smile that felt like it would crack her face. Now it was December. The cold had settled in, with a permanence that suggested it would never leave. The snow was deep, the sky a hard gray from horizon to horizon, and they were down to scraps. Literally scraps. The heels of the last loaf Sarah had baked 2 weeks ago, hard as stone now. a handful of dried beans, some coffee grounds she'd used 3 times already. Sarah pushed herself to her feet and walked to the bedroom where her mother lay. Martha was awake, her eyes following Sarah's movement. Those eyes had been so bright once, full of laughter and quick intelligence. Now they seemed faded, like cloth left too long in the sun. "How are you feeling, Mama?" Sarah asked, settling onto the edge of the narrow bed. "I'm fine, dear." Martha's voice was barely above a whisper. "You worry too much." It was the same thing she said every day, and it broke Sarah's heart every time. She reached out and took her mother's hand, feeling how thin it had become, how the bones stood out beneath papery skin. "I'll make us some soup for supper," Sarah said. "We've got those beans, and I can make dumplings with the last of the flour." Martha squeezed her fingers weakly. "You're a good girl, Sarah. Your father would be so proud of the woman you've become." Sarah had to look away, blinking against the sting in her eyes. She wouldn't cry. Not in front of her mother, not when Martha needed her to be strong. She stood and tucked the quilts more tightly around her mother's frail body. "You rest now. I'll wake you when supper's ready." Back in the main room, Sarah stood at the window and looked out at the white expanse of their valley. Somewhere under that snow was the garden she'd planted. Somewhere out there were neighbors, other families, other people. But they might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did her. The snow was too deep for travel. Even if she could make it to the nearest homestead, what could they do? Everyone was struggling just to feed their own. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of her despair. They were going to die here. Both of them. She'd known it for weeks now, but hadn't let herself think it plainly. They would starve, or the cold would take them, and come spring someone would find their bodies and bury them next to Thomas. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair, but fairness had nothing to do with survival on the frontier. The land didn't care about fair. The winter didn't care. And God, it seemed, had stopped listening to Sarah Brennan's prayers. She straightened up and wiped her eyes. Enough of that. Despair was a luxury she couldn't afford. She still had today, and her mother was still breathing, and that meant there was work to be done. She'd split those last few sticks of kindling, get a fire going, and make that soup she'd promised. They'd eat, and they'd sleep, and tomorrow she'd figure out what came next. That's when she heard it. A sound so unexpected that at first she thought she'd imagined it. The creak of saddle leather, the soft woof of a horse's breath, the muffled sound of hooves in deep snow. Someone was riding up to her cabin. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she moved away from the window. Visitors were rare any time of year, but in the dead of winter they were nearly unheard of. Her mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. Bandits sometimes roamed the territory, preying on isolated homesteads. Or it could be someone lost, desperate, dangerous in their desperation. She reached for Thomas's rifle, hanging above the door where he'd always kept it. Her hands shook as she checked the load. 1 shot. That's all she had left. 1 shot, and she'd better make it count if it came to that. The knock, when it came, was solid but not aggressive. 3 measured raps against the heavy wooden door. "Ma'am?" A man's voice, deep and rough. "Don't mean to startle you. Name's Nathaniel Cord. I'm just passing through, wondering if I might water my animals at your creek." Sarah stood frozen, the rifle heavy in her hands. Something in the voice didn't sound threatening. It sounded tired, but she'd learned not to trust first impressions. The frontier had taught her that lesson more than once. "We don't have much here," she called through the door. "Best you move on." A pause. Then, "Yes, ma'am. I understand. I'll be on my way shortly. Just need to let my horse and mule drink their fill." Sarah moved back to the window, angling herself so she could see without being easily seen. The man sat astride a rangy bay horse, and behind him trailed a mule loaded with packs and bundles. He was big, broad across the shoulders, with a thick beard dark as creek water and hair that hung past his collar. He wore buckskins, heavily patched, and a wide-brimmed hat dusted with snow. He wasn't looking at the cabin. Instead, he'd turned his horse toward the creek, visible as a dark line where the water still ran beneath a skin of ice. He moved slowly, like a man who'd learned not to make sudden movements around nervous people. Something about his patience, his respect for her fear, loosened the knot in Sarah's chest. She watched as he dismounted, his movements stiff, and led his animals down to the water's edge. He broke through the thin ice with the heel of his boot and let them drink. While they did, he stood with his back to the cabin, giving her privacy, giving her time to decide if he was a threat. From the bedroom, Martha's thin voice called out, "Sarah, who is it?" "Just a traveler, Mama. He's watering his animals. He'll be gone soon." But even as she said it, Sarah found herself studying the man more carefully. His packs looked full. Really full. The kind of supplies a man carried when he knew how to live off the land, when he'd learned to be self-sufficient. Her eyes traced the shapes beneath the canvas. Sacks that could be flour or cornmeal, bundles that might be dried meat, the distinctive bulk of blankets and furs. Hunger made her mouth water. Actual physical hunger, sharp and demanding. The man, Nathaniel, he'd said his name was, finished watering his animals and stood for a moment looking out at the valley. He seemed in no hurry to leave. After a long minute, he turned back toward the cabin, and Sarah instinctively stepped away from the window. Another knock. Softer this time. "Ma'am, I don't mean to impose, but I noticed your woodpile's buried pretty deep. If you'd like, I could dig some out for you before I go. Won't take but a few minutes." Sarah's pride warred with her need. She had been dreading the task of digging out that wood, knowing it would take her hours she didn't have, energy she couldn't spare. But accepting help from a stranger felt dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical threat. "That's kind of you," she said through the door, "but we're managing fine." Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but I've been living in these mountains for 15 years. I know what managing fine looks like in December, and I know what it doesn't look like. There's no smoke coming from your chimney, which means you're low on fuel. Your animals are gone from the barn. I can see the snow's drifted clean against the doors, and that garden plot's been sitting idle since harvest." Sarah felt heat rise in her face. How dare he catalogue her failures, her losses, as if he had any right? "I'm not trying to shame you," he continued, his voice still gentle. "Lord knows this country's hard on everybody. I'm just saying if you need help, I'm offering it. No strings, no expectations, just one person helping another because that's what decent folks do." Something in Sarah's chest cracked. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the sheer relief of someone seeing her struggle and not turning away. Maybe it was the tone of his voice, which held no pity, only understanding. She set the rifle down and opened the door. The man stood a respectful distance back, his hat in his hands. Up close, she could see he was older than she'd first thought, maybe 45 or 50, with weather lines deep around his eyes and a scar that ran from his temple into his beard. But his eyes were kind. That was the first thing she noticed. Dark brown and direct, but kind. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the offer, but I truly don't have anything to pay you with." Didn't ask for payment. He gestured toward the woodpile. "Just point me to your shovel, and I'll get started." Sarah watched him work for the next half hour, watched him dig through 3 feet of packed snow with steady, efficient movements. He didn't talk, didn't try to engage her in conversation, just worked. When he'd cleared a path to the wood and stacked a generous supply by the door, he straightened up and nodded to her. "That should hold you a few days at least." "Thank you, Mr. Cord." He turned to silence. He'd leave. And Sarah knew she should let him go. Should let him ride back into whatever solitary existence he'd come from. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way he'd worked without asking for anything in return. Maybe it was the loneliness she'd seen in his eyes, a loneliness that matched her own. Or maybe it was simply that she was so tired of being strong, of pretending everything was fine when it so clearly wasn't. "Mr. Cord," she called after him. He turned back. "Would you, that is, we don't have much, but I'm about to make some soup. You'd be welcome to share it. As thanks for your help." He studied her for a long moment, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling he could see right through her polite fiction, that he knew they didn't have much of anything, least of all food to spare for strangers. "That's kind of you, ma'am, but He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes had moved past her into the dimness of the cabin's interior, and Sarah knew what he was seeing, knew what she'd become so accustomed to that she barely noticed it anymore, the bare shelves, the empty table, the cold stove. And there, on that empty table, the last remnants of their bread, split into two pathetic portions. The expression that crossed Nathaniel Cord's face was something Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper than that. Something like recognition or remembrance, as if he'd once stood exactly where she stood now and knew precisely what it meant. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "when's the last time you or your mother had a proper meal?" Sarah's throat closed up. She couldn't answer. Couldn't admit it out loud, not even to this stranger who'd shown her nothing but kindness. Nathaniel didn't wait for an answer. He walked to his pack mule with long strides and began untying the canvas covering. Sarah watched, her hand pressed to her mouth as he pulled out a burlap sack and brought it to her door. "Cornmeal," he said simply. "I've got more than I need." He went back for another sack. "Dried venison, killed a deer 2 weeks back," and another. "Coffee. Real coffee, not grounds that have been used 3 times. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes. "Mr. Cord, we can't accept." "Yes, you can." His voice was firm now, leaving no room for argument. "And you will, because refusing help when you need it isn't pride, it's foolishness. And because I've been where you are, ma'am. Maybe not exactly, but close enough. And I remember what it felt like when someone showed me kindness I didn't think I deserved." He carried the sacks inside, past her frozen form, and set them on the table beside those pitiful bread scraps. Then he went back out for more. Beans, flour, salt, even a small tin of molasses. Sarah couldn't stop the tears now. They ran down her face in hot tracks, and she didn't even try to wipe them away. It was too much. Too much generosity from a stranger, too much relief after so much fear, too much sudden hope after she'd convinced herself there was none left. "Who's there?" Martha's voice came from the bedroom, stronger than it had been in weeks. "Sarah, what's happening?" "It's all right, Mama," Sarah managed to say. "We have a visitor. A good visitor." Nathaniel looked toward the bedroom door, then back at Sarah. "Your mother." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "She sick?" Another nod. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, then he started for the door. Sarah thought he was leaving and panic flared. Absurd panic, given that he'd already done more than anyone could expect. But he just went to his mule again and came back with a small leather pouch. "Willow bark," he said, handing it to her, "and some dried elderberry. Make a tea with both. It'll help with fever and congestion. Won't cure her, but it'll ease her some." Sarah took the pouch with shaking hands. "Why are you doing this?" Nathaniel settled his hat back on his head and looked at her with those kind, sad eyes. "Because I've been alone in these mountains for 15 years, ma'am. And in all that time I forgot something important. I forgot that people need each other. That we're meant to help one another, not just survive on our own." He paused. "I forgot that kindness matters. Maybe the most important thing there is." He moved toward the door, And this time Sarah didn't want him to leave. Didn't want to lose this strange connection, this unexpected grace. "Mr. Cord," she said, "please, stay for supper. I meant it before, but I mean it even more now. After what you've done, it's the least we can offer." He hesitated on the threshold, and Sarah could see the war playing out behind his eyes. The instinct to refuse, to maintain his distance, fighting against something else, something that looked like longing. "I don't want to impose," he said finally. "You're not. Please." He studied her face, searching for something. Whatever he found there must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly. "All right, then. Thank you. I'd be honored." Sarah felt something shift in the cabin, in the air between them, in the very fabric of what she'd thought this day would be. She'd woken up convinced this was the beginning of the end, that she and her mother would slowly fade away in this cabin, that spring would find them cold and still. Now, with this mountain man standing in her doorway and supplies stacked on her table, she felt something she'd almost forgotten the shape of. Hope. It was fragile as new ice on the creek, but it was there. "Come in," she said, stepping back. "Please, come in out of the cold. Let me build up that fire and make us something worth eating." Nathaniel Cord crossed the threshold, and without either of them knowing it in that moment, both of their lives changed forever. The trajectory of Sarah's desperation bent toward possibility. The arc of Nathaniel's isolation curved back toward humanity, all because of one act of witnessing. One moment of choosing compassion over convenience. One decision to help, expecting nothing in return. The winter wind howled outside, but inside the cabin something warmer than fire began to grow. Martha's condition had worsened overnight. Sarah could hear it in her mother's breathing, labored and ragged. They found her sitting up in bed, her face flushed with fever, her nightgown damp with sweat. "Mama," Sarah said, moving quickly to her side. She pressed her hand to Martha's forehead and felt the heat radiating from her skin. "How long have you been feeling poorly?" "Just tonight, dear. Didn't want to worry you." Martha tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "I'm sure it'll pass." Nathaniel had already moved to the stove, stoking the fire and setting water to boil. His movements were efficient, purposeful. He'd seen sickness before, knew what needed to be done. "We'll make you that tea," Sarah said, trying to keep the fear from her voice. "The one with the willow bark. That'll help with the fever." Over the next hour, they worked together without needing to speak. Nathaniel brewed the medicine while Sarah sponged her mother's face and neck with cool water. They got Martha to drink the bitter tea, speaking soft encouragements when she wanted to refuse. They piled blankets on her when she shivered, stripped them away when the fever spiked and she grew too warm. By dawn, Martha's fever had broken slightly. She slept finally, her breathing still rough but more regular. Sarah sat beside the bed, holding her mother's hand, feeling the fragility of the bones beneath the papery skin. "You should rest," Nathaniel said from the doorway. "I'll watch her. I can't leave her. You're no good to her if you're exhausted. Let me sit with her for a while. I'll wake you if anything changes." Sarah wanted to argue, but found she didn't have the strength. She was bone-tired, worn down by months of worry and the sudden terror of almost losing her mother. She nodded and stood, swaying slightly. Nathaniel caught her elbow, steadying her. The touch was brief but electric. Sarah felt it through the fabric of her dress, felt the warmth and strength of his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Go on. Sleep." She climbed to the loft and lay down without even removing her dress. Below, she could hear Nathaniel settling into the chair beside Martha's bed, could hear his low voice speaking quietly, words she couldn't make out, but whose tone was unmistakably gentle. She fell asleep to that sound, to the knowledge that she wasn't alone in this fight. When she woke, it was late afternoon. The light slanting through the loft window had that golden quality of winter sun low on the horizon. For a moment, panic gripped her. She'd slept the entire day. But then she heard voices below. Martha's voice, weak but present, and Nathaniel's deeper rumble in response. She climbed down to find them at the table. Martha was dressed and sitting up, still pale but alert. A bowl of broth sat before her, half finished. Nathaniel was working on something with his hands. Whittling, she realized. A piece of wood was slowly taking shape beneath his knife. "Sarah," Martha said, her voice hoarse but glad. "There you are, dear. I was beginning to worry. How are you feeling?" "Much better. Whatever that tea was, it worked wonders. And Mr. Cord here has been keeping me company, telling me stories about the mountains." Sarah met Nathaniel's eyes over her mother's head. He gave a small shrug, but she could see the relief in his expression. Martha was going to be all right. This time. "What are you making?" Sarah asked, moving closer to see his work. "A bird." He held up the partially carved piece of wood. "For your mother. She mentioned she used to keep canaries when she was young. Can't give her the real thing up here, but maybe a wooden one will do." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. This rough mountain man, this stranger who'd wandered into their lives just days ago, was carving a gift for her mother, creating beauty from a chunk of wood because Martha had mentioned a memory from her youth. "That's very kind," she managed to say. "It's nothing, just something to pass the time." But it wasn't nothing. It was thoughtfulness, care, the kind of attention that came from truly listening to people, from valuing their stories and memories. Over the following days, Martha continued to improve. The fever didn't return and her strength began to build. The good food and Nathaniel's medicine were working their magic. But the scare had reminded them all how fragile their situation remained. One illness, one accident, one bad turn of weather could undo everything. Nathaniel's promised few days stretched into a week, then toward 2. The repairs to the cabin were long finished, but he kept finding other tasks. He built a better door for the root cellar. He fashioned a sled for hauling wood from the forest. He showed Sarah how to set proper snares for rabbits and taught her to read weather signs in the clouds and wind. She learned quickly, hungry for the knowledge that might help them survive. But more than that, she enjoyed his company. Enjoyed the quiet way he moved through the world, the careful consideration he gave before speaking, the dry humor that occasionally surfaced in his words. One afternoon, when Martha was napping and they were both outside checking his snares, Sarah finally voiced the question that had been building in her mind. "Why are you really staying, Nathaniel?" He didn't pretend not to understand. "Truth? Please." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. When he spoke, his words came slowly, carefully. "I spent 15 years telling myself I was better off alone, that people were a complication I didn't need, that grief was easier to bear in silence." He turned to look at her. "But being here, with you and Martha, I remembered something. Remembered that loneliness isn't the same as peace. That isolation isn't protection, it's just another kind of dying." Sarah's breath caught. She understood exactly what he meant. "I should probably leave," he continued. "People will talk. It's not proper, me staying here like this. Let them talk. It could damage your reputation, make it harder for you when I'm gone." The words hung between them. When I'm gone. Not if, but when. The assumption that this was temporary, that eventually he'd return to his mountains and his solitude. "What if you didn't go?" Sarah heard herself say. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him. "Sarah, what if you stayed? Not just for repairs or until the weather breaks. What if you stayed through the winter? Through the spring?" She was rushing now, words tumbling out before courage could fail her. We could use the help. The homestead needs work we can't do alone, and you said yourself you're tired of being lonely. It's not that simple. Why not? You have nothing pulling you back to the mountains. No obligations, no ties. You could stay here, help us rebuild, help us make this place what Thomas dreamed it could be. Nathaniel's expression was torn between longing and fear. And what happens when spring comes? When the snow melts and you can get to town, find a man closer to your age? Someone who doesn't carry the weight I carry? I'm not looking for someone else. The words were out before Sarah could stop them. Bold and revealing. She felt her face flush but didn't look away. Couldn't look away. Sarah, you barely know me. I know enough. I know you're kind. I know you're honorable. I know you see me as more than just a widow who needs rescuing. I know that having you here feels right in a way I can't explain and don't want to question. Your husband would want me to be happy. Would want me to live, not just survive. Would want his daughter. She stopped, surprised by her own words. She and Thomas had never had children, though they'd hoped. But suddenly, the idea didn't seem impossible. Suddenly, the future seemed like something that could hold more than just loss. Nathaniel stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could see the war being fought behind them. I'm 20 years older than you, he said quietly. I don't care. I'm not an easy man. I've spent too long alone. I've forgotten how to... So have I. We'll remember together. He reached up and touched her face, his calloused palm rough against her cheek. The gesture was tentative, questioning. Sarah leaned into it, answering the question without words. I'm afraid, he admitted. Afraid of hoping again. Afraid of having something to lose. I know, I'm afraid too. But I'm more afraid of letting you walk away because we're both too scared to try. Nathaniel pulled her close, and Sarah went into his arms without hesitation. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the winter afternoon, two people who'd been hollowed out by loss, finding unexpected solace in each other's presence. I'll stay, he said finally. Through the winter at least. We'll see what spring brings. Sarah pulled back enough to look at him. That's all I'm asking. A chance. Time to see if this thing between us is real or just, it's real. His voice was certain. Don't doubt that. I just need to learn how to trust it. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, neither speaking about what had just passed between them, but both knowing something fundamental had shifted. When they came inside, Martha took one look at their faces and smiled. About time, was all she said, but her eyes twinkled with satisfaction. That night, after Martha had gone to bed, Sarah and Nathaniel sat by the fire. The wooden bird was finished, a perfect little carving that captured the essence of a canary in flight. Nathaniel had even painted it with supplies from his pack, giving it bright yellow feathers and a tiny black beak. It's beautiful, Sarah said, turning it in her hands. She'll love it. Your mother's a good woman. Strong. Reminds me of my own mother in some ways. Will you tell me about her? About your family? And so he did. He talked about his parents, hard-scrabble farmers in Ohio, about his wife, Caroline, who'd been a preacher's daughter with a laugh that could light up a room, about his daughter Emma, who'd been 5 years old when she died, who'd loved to pick wild flowers and sing made-up songs. He talked about the grief that had driven him away, about the years of wandering that had eventually brought him to the mountains, about the slow hardening of his heart, the deliberate numbing of feeling, about waking up one day and realizing he'd become less than human, more like the animals he trapped, existing but not really living. Sarah listened, holding his hand, offering the comfort of presence without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. She understood that some wounds never fully healed. You just learn to carry them. When he was done talking, exhausted by the weight of memory, she spoke her own truth. Thomas was my first love. My only love, I thought. When he died, I believed that part of me died too. That I'd spend the rest of my life as half a person, going through motions but never really feeling again. And now I think maybe I was wrong. Maybe the heart is bigger than we give it credit for. Maybe it can hold more than one love. Maybe losing someone doesn't mean we can't find someone else. Nathaniel looked at her with such naked hope that it made her chest ache. I don't want to replace him, he said. I can't be Thomas. I don't want you to be. I want you to be Nathaniel. That's enough, more than enough. He kissed her then, gentle and questioning at first, then deeper as she responded. It felt like coming home and setting out on a journey at the same time, familiar and new, frightening and right. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers. Stay with me, Sarah whispered. Not just through winter. Stay. I'll stay, he promised. As long as you'll have me. The morning after their kiss, Sarah woke with a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt since before Thomas died. The guilt came swiftly on its heels. How could she feel happy when her husband was 6 months in the ground? But then she remembered Thomas's words from their last lucid conversation, when he'd known he was dying and had tried to tell her everything important in the few breaths he had left. Don't spend your life grieving me, he'd whispered. Promise me, Sarah. Promise you'll live. She'd promised, and she'd meant it in the moment, though she hadn't understood what it would actually require. Now she was beginning to understand. Living meant opening herself to the possibility of loss again. Meant risking her heart, even knowing it could be broken. Meant choosing hope over safety. She climbed down from the loft to find Nathaniel already up, as always, with coffee made and the fire built up against the morning chill. But today something was different in the way he looked at her. His eyes held warmth that hadn't been there before, acknowledgement of what had passed between them. Morning, he said, and even that simple word carried new weight. Morning. They moved around each other carefully, both aware of the shift in their relationship, but not quite sure how to navigate it. Martha watched them with knowing eyes, but mercifully said nothing, though Sarah caught her mother's satisfied smile more than once. After breakfast, Nathaniel announced he was riding to town. We need supplies, and I should— He paused, glancing at Sarah. I should make some things clear, about my intentions, about staying. Sarah understood what he meant. He was going to establish their relationship publicly, claim his place here officially. It was both practical and symbolic. She felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with anticipation. Be safe, was all she said. Always am. He left mid-morning and the cabin felt emptier without him. Sarah tried to keep busy, mending clothes, organizing the supplies he'd given them, tending to Martha. But her mind kept wandering to Nathaniel on the trail, imagining his arrival in town, the questions he'd face, the explanations he'd give. That afternoon, while Martha napped, Sarah decided to tackle the chest of Thomas's belongings that she'd been avoiding since his death. She pulled it from beneath the bed and sat on the floor beside it, steeling herself before lifting the lid. His clothes were folded neatly inside, work shirts and denim pants, the good suit he'd worn to their wedding. Sarah ran her hands over the fabric, remembering him wearing these things, remembering the man he'd been. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had lost some of its sharp edges. Now it felt more like a bitter-sweet ache, painful but bearable. Beneath the clothes, she found papers, letters from his family back in Missouri, receipts from supplies purchased, notes he'd made about the homestead, and at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a leather folder she'd never seen before. Sarah opened it carefully and found herself looking at official documents, the deed to their land, as she'd expected, but also other papers, Correspondence with a judge in Cheyenne, letters discussing a legal case Thomas had been peripherally involved in years before, when he'd worked as a carpenter building courtrooms and government offices. She read through the letters slowly, piecing together a story she'd never known. Thomas had witnessed something years ago, before they married. Some kind of altercation or crime. He'd given a statement, and his testimony had been important enough that the judge had kept in touch with him, updating him on the case's progress. The final letter was dated just a month before Thomas died. The judge wrote thanking him for his earlier testimony and noting that the case had finally been resolved. Sarah set the letters aside, touched by this glimpse into a part of Thomas's life she'd never known about. He'd been involved in something important, had stood up for what was right even when it might have been easier to look away. She was still sorting through the papers when Martha called from the bedroom. "Sarah, can you come here, dear?" Sarah found her mother sitting up, looking more alert than she had in days. The good food and rest were clearly helping. Martha patted the bed beside her. "Sit with me a moment." Sarah sat, and Martha took her hand. "I want to talk to you about Mr. Cord, about Nathaniel." "Mama?" "Hush and let me speak. I'm old and I'm sick, and I've earned the right to say what needs saying." Martha's voice was gentle but firm. "I see the way you look at each other. I see something growing between you, and I want you to know that I approve. More than approve, I'm grateful for it. It's too soon. Thomas has only been gone. Thomas is gone, child. And he loved you too much to want you to spend the rest of your life alone. You're young yet. You deserve a chance at happiness again." Martha squeezed her hand. "And Nathaniel is a good man. I know it in my bones. He's kind and decent and honorable. More than that, he sees you, really sees you. Not just as Thomas's widow or my daughter, but as Sarah, as yourself." Tears pricked Sarah's eyes. "I feel guilty." "I know. But guilt won't keep you warm at night, won't help you rebuild this homestead, won't give you the children you deserve to have. Thomas would understand that. He'd want you to choose life over loyalty to his memory." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I know what it's like to lose a husband. Your father died, and I thought I'd never smile again. But time passed, and eventually I did smile. I did laugh. I found joy in small things. In you, in watching you grow, in the simple pleasure of a sunny day. That doesn't mean I loved your father any less. It just means I was still alive, and the living have to keep living." Sarah rested her head on her mother's shoulder, feeling the comfort of being someone's child again, even at her age. Martha stroked her hair like she used to do when Sarah was small. "What if I'm making a mistake?" Sarah whispered. "What if he leaves? What if the sun doesn't rise tomorrow? What if the creek runs dry? What if 1,000 things that might never happen? You can't live your life afraid of what might go wrong. You have to take the risk. Have to trust that some things are worth the chance of being hurt." They sat in silence for a while, mother and daughter, holding each other in the winter afternoon light. Finally, Martha spoke again. "There's something else I need to tell you. Something I've been putting off because I didn't want to worry you." Sarah lifted her head, alarmed by her mother's serious tone. "What is it?" "I'm not going to live forever, dear. This illness, it's getting worse, not better. The medicine helps and the good food is giving me strength, but I can feel it. Deep in my lungs, in my bones, I'm wearing out." "Don't say that. You're getting better. You just said—" "I said I'm stronger today than yesterday, and I might be stronger tomorrow than today. But the overall trajectory is downward, and we both need to face that truth." Martha cupped Sarah's face in her hands. "Which is why I need you to listen carefully. When I'm gone, I don't want you to be alone. I want you to have Nathaniel. I want you to have someone who'll take care of you the way you've taken care of me. Mama, please, promise me. Promise me you'll let yourself love him. Promise you won't push him away out of some misguided sense of duty to the past. The past is gone, Sarah. The future is all that matters now. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to deny that her mother was dying, wanted to rage against the unfairness of it all. But looking into Martha's eyes, she saw the truth there, saw her mother's quiet acceptance of what was coming, and she found herself nodding. I promise. Good girl. Martha lay back against the pillows, exhausted by the intensity of the conversation. Now help me with some of that soup Nathaniel made. I need to keep my strength up. Sarah helped her mother eat, her mind spinning with everything that had been said. The revelation about Thomas's involvement in some legal case, Martha's blessing on her relationship with Nathaniel, the acknowledgement of her mother's declining health. It was almost too much to process. Nathaniel returned just before dusk, riding up to the cabin with his pack mule laden with supplies. Sarah went out to meet him, and he swung down from his horse with a smile that transformed his weathered face. Got everything we need, he said. Flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, enough to get us through to spring easily. That must have cost. Don't worry about cost. I've been saving for 15 years with nothing to spend it on. Might as well put it to good use. They unloaded the supplies together, working in companionable silence. When everything was stored, Nathaniel turned to her. I talked to the land office while I was in town. Registered my intention to stay here, help work the homestead. Made it official. Sarah felt warmth bloom in her chest. And what did they say? Said it was irregular but not improper, especially given your circumstances. A widow with a sick mother, needing help to maintain the property. They recorded it in their books. Anyone asks, I am here as hired help, which is technically true even if the payment is room and board instead of wages. Is that all you told them? Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice dropping to something more intimate. I told them the truth, that I'm here because I want to be, because I found something in this valley worth staying for. He kissed her then, there in the barn with the horses looking on and the last light of day fading outside. And Sarah kissed him back, letting herself feel the full weight of her hope and fear and desperate, fragile joy. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his chest and felt his heart beating steady and strong. My mother says I have her blessing, Sarah said quietly. She approves of you, of us. I'm glad. Her opinion matters. She also says she's dying. Nathaniel's arms tightened around her. I know, I've seen the signs. How long? Hard to say. Could be months. Could be less. But she's at peace with it, Sarah. I can see that in her. She's not afraid. Sarah let herself cry then, let Nathaniel hold her while she grieved for the mother she was losing, the husband she'd already lost, the life she'd imagined that had crumbled around her. And when the tears were spent, she lifted her face and found him looking at her with such tenderness that she felt her heart might break from the beauty of it. Stay with me, she said again. Always, he promised. For as long as you'll have me. I'm not going anywhere. 3 weeks after Nathaniel's trip to town, on a morning when the sun was bright on fresh snow and the world seemed peaceful, everything changed. Sarah was in the barn gathering eggs from the 2 chickens Nathaniel had purchased in town when she heard the sound of horses. Multiple horses, approaching fast. Her first thought was that Nathaniel was returning from checking his trap lines, but he'd left on foot that morning and wouldn't be back until afternoon. She emerged from the barn to see 3 riders approaching the cabin. 2 wore the rough clothes of working men, but the third was dressed more formally, with a star pinned to his coat that caught the sunlight. A U.S. Marshal. Sarah's heart began to pound. Marshals didn't come to isolated homesteads without serious reason. She glanced toward the cabin where Martha was resting, then back at the approaching riders. Where was Nathaniel? Still out checking the trap lines, too far away to know what was happening. The marshal dismounted first, a tall man with gray hair and hard eyes. He touched his hat brim politely. "Mrs. Brennan?" "Yes. Can I help you?" "I'm Marshal James Pritchard. These are my deputies. I'm looking for a man named Nathaniel Cord. We have information he's been staying here." Sarah's mouth went dry. "He's been helping with the homestead." "Why?" Pritchard pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I have a warrant for his arrest. Murder charge from 15 years back. There's been a bounty on him all this time, and someone in town recognized him when he came in for supplies." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Murder. Nathaniel was wanted for murder. Sarah felt her legs go weak, felt her mind trying to process what she was hearing while simultaneously rejecting it as impossible. There must be some mistake. "No mistake, ma'am. Nathaniel Cord, charged with killing a man named William Hartwell in the Wyoming Territory, spring of 1872. He fled before trial and hasn't been seen since." "That's not... he wouldn't..." Sarah's voice failed her. The cabin door opened and Martha appeared, wrapped in blankets. "What's going on out here?" "Ma'am, you should go back inside," Pritchard said. "This doesn't concern you." "If it concerns my daughter, it concerns me." Martha's voice was weak but determined. "What's this about?" "Your hired man is wanted for murder. I'm here to bring him in." Martha's hand went to her throat. She looked at Sarah, and Sarah saw her own shock reflected in her mother's face. But beneath the shock was something else. Something that looked like doubt, like she was trying to reconcile what they were being told with the man they'd come to know. "Mr. Cord has been nothing but kind and decent to us," Martha said firmly. "I don't believe he's capable of murder." "Belief doesn't change facts, ma'am. The warrant's legal and binding." Pritchard turned back to Sarah. "Where is he?" Sarah's mind raced. If she told them, they'd take Nathaniel away. He'd hang. But if she lied, if she helped him escape, she'd be breaking the law herself, could be charged as an accomplice. Everything they'd built over these past weeks, the hope, the promise of a future, was crumbling before her eyes. "I don't know," she heard herself say. "He went out early, could be anywhere on the property." It wasn't quite a lie. She didn't know exactly where Nathaniel was at this moment, but she knew his general direction, knew he'd be back in a few hours. She was buying time. For what, she didn't know. "We'll wait then." Pritchard gestured to his deputies. "Search the barn and outbuildings. Make sure he's not hiding somewhere close." The next hours were agony. The marshal and his men made themselves comfortable in the yard, their horses tied to the rail, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Sarah stayed in the cabin with Martha, both of them silent, both struggling with what they'd learned. "I can't believe it," Sarah said finally. "He saved us. He's been so good to us. How could he—" "We don't know that he did," Martha interrupted. "We only know he's accused. There's a difference. The marshal has a warrant. That's not just an accusation. Warrants can be wrong. Evidence can be false. You know that as well as I do." Martha reached for Sarah's hand. "Talk to him. When he comes back, before they take him, talk to him. Give him a chance to explain." Sarah nodded, though dread sat heavy in her stomach. What explanation could there be? What story could make this right? She watched through the window as the sun climbed higher, as shadows shortened and then began to lengthen again. And finally, in mid-afternoon, she saw him. A distant figure moving through the trees, making his way toward the cabin with the easy gait of a man at peace with his world. Nathaniel emerged from the forest and stopped dead when he saw the horses. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the change in his posture, the stiffening, the readiness. He knew instantly what those horses meant. For a long moment, he stood frozen. Sarah could imagine the calculations running through his mind. He could run, could fade back into the trees and disappear into the mountains he knew so well. The marshal's men would never find him if he didn't want to be found. But he didn't run. Instead, after that long pause, He squared his shoulders and walked forward. Walked straight toward the cabin, toward the waiting marshal, toward whatever fate awaited him. Pritchard and his deputy stood as Nathaniel approached. Hands moved toward guns, though none drew. Nathaniel kept his own hands visible, away from the knife at his belt. "Marshal," he said calmly, "I assume you're here for me." "Nathaniel Cord?" "That's right. I have a warrant for your arrest. Murder of William Hartwell, 1872. Pritchard pulled out shackles. "You need to come with me." Nathaniel didn't resist as they put the shackles on his wrists. His eyes found Sarah in the window, held her gaze for a long moment. She saw apology there, regret, but also something that looked like resignation, as if he'd always known this day would come. Sarah burst from the cabin. "Wait, you have to let him explain. You have to—" "Sarah, don't!" Nathaniel's voice was gentle but firm. "It's all right. I'll go peacefully." "It's not all right. None of this is all right." She turned to Pritchard. "He saved our lives. He's a good man. Whatever happened 15 years ago will be sorted out in court." Pritchard finished. "That's how the law works, ma'am. I'm sorry. At least let me talk to him. Please, just 5 minutes." Pritchard hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. My men will be right here." He stepped back, giving them a small circle of privacy. Nathaniel looked at Sarah with such pain in his eyes that she almost couldn't bear it. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have told you. Should have warned you this might happen. Is it true? Did you kill someone?" "No." His voice was absolutely certain. "But I know who did, and I witnessed it, and that made me almost as dangerous as if I'd done it myself. Tell me what happened. All of it." Nathaniel glanced at the waiting marshal, then back to Sarah. When he spoke, his words came quickly, urgently, as if he needed to get the whole story out before time ran out. 15 years ago, I was working as a carpenter in a town called Thornton, south of here. One night I was walking home from a job and I saw an argument in an alley. 2 men. One was William Hartwell, a drifter who'd been causing trouble in town. The other was a young man named Robert Calhoun, son of the biggest rancher in the territory. The Calhouns owned half the land around Thornton, had influence with the territorial government, the courts, everything. He paused, his jaw tight with old anger. I saw Robert Calhoun shoot William Hartwell in cold blood. Over a card game, over some imagined slight. I never knew the full reason. Hartwell was unarmed, pleading for his life. Calhoun shot him anyway. Then he saw me watching. Sarah felt cold all the way to her bones. "What happened?" "Calhoun threatened me. Said if I told anyone what I'd seen, his family would destroy me. But I couldn't. I couldn't let a man get away with murder. So I went to the sheriff, told him what I'd witnessed. And the Calhouns had more power than I'd imagined. Within a day, witnesses started coming forward, saying they'd seen me arguing with Hartwell earlier. Evidence appeared, a gun that supposedly belonged to me, found near the body. My testimony was dismissed as an attempt to cover my own guilt. The whole town turned against me." Nathaniel's voice was hollow with old pain. "I had a wife then, Caroline, and a little daughter. The Calhouns made it clear that if I didn't confess, if I kept insisting Robert was the killer, they'd go after my family. They'd ruin us, destroy everything we had. But if I left town quietly, if I disappeared, they'd leave Caroline and Emma alone. So you ran." "I ran. Figured I could hide for a while, let things cool down, maybe find someone who'd believe me. Someone with more power than the Calhouns." His voice cracked. "But while I was hiding in the mountains, fever hit the town. Caroline and Emma both died. By the time I found out, they'd been in the ground for weeks, and I couldn't go back. Couldn't face their graves knowing I'd failed to protect them, so I just stayed in the mountains. 15 years I stayed, telling myself it was safer, that I was protecting their memory. But really, I was just a coward, running from the pain. Tears streamed down Sarah's face. You're not a coward. You were trying to protect your family. I made the wrong choice. Should have fought, should have stood my ground. Instead, I let a murderer go free and spent 15 years hiding. He looked at her with desperate intensity. But I need you to believe me, Sarah. I didn't kill anyone. I'm guilty of cowardice, of running, of 1,000 failures. But not murder. I believe you. The words came without hesitation. She did believe him. Knew it in her bones the way her mother had known he was a good man. What can we do? How do we prove it? I don't know if we can. The Calhouns are powerful. Robert's father is probably still alive, still controlling half the territory. Any witnesses who might have supported me are long gone or too scared to speak up. Marshal Pritchard stepped forward. Time's up. Sarah grabbed Nathaniel's shackled hands. I won't let them do this to you. I'll find a way to prove your innocence. I swear it. Sarah, no, don't put yourself at risk for me. Too late. You put yourself at risk for us. Now it's my turn. The deputies started to pull Nathaniel toward the horses. He resisted just long enough to say one more thing. The judge who handled the original case. His name was Samuel Whitmore. He's in Cheyenne. If anyone might remember the truth, might have doubts about the verdict, it would be him. But Sarah, be careful, the Calhouns are dangerous. Then they had him on a horse, his hands bound to the saddle horn. Pritchard mounted his own horse and looked down at Sarah. For what it's worth, ma'am, he could have run, could have disappeared into those mountains and we'd never have found him. The fact that he didn't, that he came in peacefully, says something about his character. Will that matter in court? I don't know, but it might. They rode away, taking Nathaniel with them. Sarah stood in the yard watching until they disappeared from view, her mind already racing. Judge Samuel Whitmore in Cheyenne. That was a name, a thread to pull, a place to start. She turned back to the cabin and found Martha standing in the doorway. We're going to prove his innocence, Sarah said, her voice hard with determination. Whatever it takes. Martha nodded. Then we'd better figure out how, because if the Calhouns are as powerful as he says, this won't be easy. I don't care how hard it is. Nathaniel saved our lives. Now we're going to save his. She went inside and pulled out the chest of Thomas's papers. Somewhere in those letters, in that correspondence with Judge Whitmore, might be the key to saving the man she'd grown to love. The man who'd shown her that hope was possible, that second chances existed, that the future could hold more than just survival. She wouldn't let that future be taken away. Not without a fight. Whitmore spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of regret and determination to make things right. Your Honor, the evidence is overwhelming. Robert Calhoun killed William Hartwell. Multiple witnesses have confirmed his deathbed confession. The original. Trial was corrupted by political influence and manufactured evidence. Nathaniel Cord has spent 15 years in exile for a crime he didn't commit. 15 years of lost life, lost opportunities, lost happiness. Justice demands that we correct this terrible wrong. The Calhoun lawyer stood next, but his arguments felt hollow. He tried to suggest the confession was fabricated, that the witnesses were lying, that the original conviction should stand. But without the Calhoun family's power to intimidate and bribe, his words had no teeth. Sarah could see it in Judge Hammond's expression. The man wasn't buying it. Finally, Hammond held up his hand for silence. The courtroom went still, every eye on the judge as he reviewed his notes. The wait felt eternal. I've heard compelling evidence today, Hammond began. Evidence that suggests a grave miscarriage of justice occurred 15 years ago. Robert Calhoun's deathbed confession, corroborated by multiple witnesses, carries significant weight. The irregularities in the original trial, as documented by Judge Whitmore, are deeply troubling. and Mr. Mosley's testimony provides crucial contemporary evidence of Mr. Calhoun's guilt and Mr. Cord's innocence. He looked directly at Nathaniel. "Mr. Cord, I cannot give you back the 15 years you lost. I cannot undo the pain and isolation you've endured, but I can ensure that you don't spend one more day suffering for a crime you didn't commit." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The motion to vacate the conviction is granted. All charges against Nathaniel Cord are dismissed. You are a free man, sir. I apologize, on behalf of this court and this territory, for the injustice you've suffered. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered, others shouted in protest. The Calhoun lawyer was already gathering his papers, his face red with anger. But Sarah heard none of it. She was on her feet, pushing through the crowd toward Nathaniel. He stood slowly, as if unable to believe what he'd just heard. A deputy was removing his shackles, and Nathaniel stared at his freed wrists like they belonged to someone else. Then he looked up and saw Sarah running toward him. She collided with him hard enough to knock him back a step. His arms came around her, strong and sure, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt the solid reality of him, alive. Free. Hers. "You did it," he whispered into her hair. "Sarah, you did it. We did it. All of us." She pulled back to look at his face. "You're free, Nathaniel. Really free." He touched her face with wonder, as if assuring himself she was real. "I thought I'd never see you again. When they took me away, I thought—" "I know what you thought, but you should have known better. I told you I wasn't letting you go." Judge Whitmore approached, his old face creased with satisfaction. "Mr. Cord, I hope you can forgive me for my role in your conviction. I've regretted it every day for 15 years. Nathaniel extended his hand. "Nothing to forgive, Your Honor. You did what you could in an impossible situation, and you came through when it mattered most." They shook hands, and Sarah saw the relief in Whitmore's expression, the weight of old guilt finally lifting. Marshal Pritchard appeared next, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "Mr. Cord, I apologize for the arrest. I was doing my job, but I'm glad I was wrong about you." "No apology needed, Marshal. You treated me fairly." People crowded around to congratulate them, to apologize, to express their outrage at the Calhoun family's corruption. Sarah stayed close to Nathaniel, her hand in his, refusing to let go. She'd traveled 3 days through winter conditions to get here. She'd searched dangerous places for witnesses. She'd faced down lawyers and testified in front of a hostile crowd, all to reach this moment. Outside the courthouse, the winter sun was bright on new snow. Nathaniel stopped on the steps and just breathed, looking at the world with new eyes. "I spent so long thinking I was guilty," he said quietly. "Not of murder, but of cowardice, of running instead of fighting, of letting fear rule my life." He turned to Sarah. "But you showed me something different. You showed me that courage means fighting for what matters, even when you're terrified, even when the odds are against you." "I learned that from you," Sarah said. "You could have ridden past our cabin that day, could have left us to our fate, but you stopped, you helped, you stayed. That took more courage than you know." Nathaniel pulled her close again, and this time when he kissed her, it was in front of the entire crowd, publicly claiming their relationship, making his intentions clear to anyone who cared to see. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah rested her forehead against his. "Let's go home," she said. "Home." Nathaniel tested the word like he was tasting it. "I haven't had a home in 15 years. You do now, with me and Mama at the homestead, if you want it." "I want it more than anything in this world." They collected their things from the hotel and prepared for the journey back. Sarah sent a telegram to Mrs. Henderson asking her to check on Martha, to tell her mother that they'd won, that Nathaniel was free, that they were coming home. As they rode out of Cheyenne the next morning, Nathaniel on a horse he'd purchased with his first act as a free man, Sarah felt something settle in her chest. Peace. Hope. the certainty that they'd overcome the worst and could face whatever came next together. The journey back took 4 days. They traveled slowly, carefully, stopping at night to rest and talk. Nathaniel told her more about his lost family, about the young man he'd been before grief changed him. Sarah told him about her childhood, about her dreams for the homestead, about the future she wanted to build. On the 4th night, camped beside a frozen stream with stars, bright overhead, Nathaniel took her hand. "Sarah Brennan, I know I'm not what you planned for. I'm older, I'm damaged. I come with more baggage than any reasonable woman should accept, but I love you. I've loved you since the day you invited me into your cabin and gave me hope I didn't deserve. Will you marry me?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." He pulled a ring from his pocket. Simple silver, purchased in Cheyenne during one of her witness hunting expeditions. "It's not gold," he said apologetically. "Not fancy. It's perfect." She let him slide it onto her finger, feeling the weight of it, the promise it represented. "Everything about this is perfect." They held each other in the firelight, 2 people who'd been broken by loss and remade by love. Tomorrow they'd reach the homestead. Tomorrow they'd start their life together officially. But tonight, under stars that had witnessed both their sorrows and their joys, they simply existed in the moment. Free. Together. Home. Spring came to the Wyoming Valley like a promise kept. The snow melted gradually, revealing the brown grass beneath, then the first brave shoots of green. The creek ran high with snowmelt, singing its way past the cabin where Sarah and Nathaniel had spent the winter building a life together. They'd arrived home from Cheyenne to find Martha, weaker but alive, tended carefully by Mrs. Henderson. The neighbor woman had stayed through Sarah's absence, sleeping on the floor by the fire, making sure Martha ate and took her medicine. Sarah had paid her with some of Thomas's remaining gold, but Mrs. Henderson had protested. "That's not necessary. We help each other out here. That's how we survive." But she'd taken the money anyway, and her eyes had grown soft with understanding when she saw how Sarah and Nathaniel looked at each other. The wedding had been simple. Marshal Pritchard, passing through on his way to another assignment, had agreed to stand as witness. Mrs. Henderson had come with her husband and 3 children. They'd gathered in the cabin on a February morning, with Martha propped up in bed so she could watch, and a traveling preacher had spoken the words that bound Sarah and Nathaniel together. Sarah had worn her best dress, the same one she'd worn to the trial. Nathaniel had bought a new shirt in town, dark blue that brought out his eyes. They'd exchanged vows with hands clasped tight, voices steady with certainty. "I, Nathaniel, take you, Sarah, to be my wife. I promise to honor you, protect you, and love you for all the days of my life. I, Sarah, take you, Nathaniel, to be my husband. I promise to stand beside you, support you, and love you through whatever comes." The ring Nathaniel had given her in the wilderness now had a companion, a matching silver band on his finger. When the preacher pronounced them married, Nathaniel had kissed her with such tenderness that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. Martha had wept too, but they were tears of joy. "I'm so happy for you both," she'd whispered when they went to her afterward. "So very happy." She'd lived to see the snow begin to melt, lived to see the first crocuses push through the softening earth, lived to know that her daughter was loved and cared for, that the homestead would continue, that everything they'd sacrificed for had meaning. Martha Brennan died on the 1st day of April, peacefully in her sleep, with Sarah holding one hand and Nathaniel holding the other. Her last words had been, "Thank you for everything, for giving me a good death." They buried her beside Thomas in the grove of aspens that had begun to leaf out in pale green. Nathaniel carved a wooden headstone, simple but beautiful, with Martha's name and the years of her life. Sarah planted wild flowers on the grave, the same kind Martha had loved in her youth. She was ready, Nathaniel said as they stood by the fresh-turned earth. You could see it in her eyes. She'd made her peace. I know, but I'll miss her terribly. So will I. She gave me her blessing, made me feel like I had family again. Sarah leaned into his side. You do have family. You have me. I know, and I'm grateful for it every single day. The months that followed were filled with work and hope in equal measure. Nathaniel expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a workshop where he could practice his carpentry. They planted a larger garden than Sarah had attempted alone, working side by side in the warming earth. Nathaniel built proper fences, repaired the barn until it was sound, and constructed a chicken coop that housed a growing flock. Neighbors began to stop by more frequently. Word had spread about Nathaniel's exoneration, about the Calhoun corruption, and sentiment had shifted entirely. People who might once have judged their arrangement now brought gifts and offered help. The community that had seemed so distant during Sarah's darkest days was present now, woven into the fabric of their new life. In June, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. She told Nathaniel one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. I'm going to have a baby. He'd gone very still, his face unreadable. Then tears had started down his weathered cheeks, silent tears that spoke to grief and joy intermingled. I never thought, after Emma died, I never thought I'd have another child. Are you happy? Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He'd pulled her close, one hand splayed across her still flat belly. Terrified, grateful, amazed, all of it at once. They spent that summer preparing. Nathaniel built a cradle from pine he'd felled and seasoned himself, carving it with intricate patterns of birds and flowers. Sarah sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands remembering the skills her mother had taught her. They talked about names, about the future, about the life they were building. On a warm July afternoon, Sarah stood in the doorway of their cabin and looked out at their land. The garden was flourishing, heavy with vegetables that would see them through another winter. The barn was full of hay Nathaniel had cut and stored. Chickens scratched in the yard, and in the pasture 3 horses grazed, Buck, Nathaniel's bay, and a young mare they'd purchased with dreams of breeding stock. The cabin itself had been transformed. What had been a place of near starvation and despair was now a home filled with life and laughter. Nathaniel's belongings mixed with hers and Thomas's. New furniture stood beside old. Pictures hung on walls that had been bare. And on the mantel, in a place of honor, sat 3 things. Martha's silver locket, the wooden bird Nathaniel had carved for her, and a new family Bible Sarah had purchased in Cheyenne. The first page was filled with names now, births and deaths and marriages that told the story of their joined lives. Nathaniel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her expanded waist. What are you thinking about? How much has changed? How different everything is from a year ago? Better or worse? She leaned back against him, feeling his strength, his presence, his love. So much better. Better than I ever imagined possible. Even with everything you lost, Thomas, your mother, the life you planned, even with that, I loved Thomas. I'll always love him, and I miss my mother every day. But grief and joy aren't opposites. They can exist together. I can honor what I lost while celebrating what I've found. She turned in his arms to face him. You taught me that. You showed me that surviving tragedy doesn't mean forgetting the good that came before. It means carrying it forward, building on it. Nathaniel kissed her forehead. You saved my life, Sarah. Not just from the noose, but from a death that was slower and harder. The death of living without hope, without love, without purpose. Then we saved each other. As evening fell, they went inside and lit the lamps. Nathaniel prepared supper while Sarah set the table. 2 places now, but soon to be 3. They ate together, talking about the day's work and tomorrow's plans. Simple conversation, the kind shared by couples everywhere. But for two people who'd known such profound loneliness, such desperate isolation, these simple moments felt like miracles. Later, as they lay in bed with Nathaniel's hand resting on Sarah's belly, feeling the baby move within, Sarah thought about the mountain man who'd ridden up to her door on a winter day when she'd lost all hope. How one act of compassion had changed both their fates. How unexpected kindness had led to unexpected love. She thought about Thomas and Martha, both gone now but never forgotten. She liked to imagine them somewhere watching, approving, glad that the people they'd loved had found a way forward through the grief they'd left behind. And she thought about the child growing within her, a new life, a new beginning, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and its capacity to rebuild after loss. "I love you," Nathaniel whispered in the darkness. "I love you too." Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the pines. In the grove of aspens, wildflowers bloomed on two graves, and in the cabin on Crazy Woman Creek, two people who'd been broken and remade held each other close and dreamed of the future. Sometimes the hardest thing in life is watching someone you love go hungry when there's nothing left to give. But sometimes, if you're very lucky, a stranger rides into your life at exactly the right moment. Sometimes compassion changes everything. Sometimes hope is rewarded with happiness earned through struggle and sacrifice. And sometimes, just sometimes, the story doesn't end with loss. Sometimes it ends with love, with family, with the promise of tomorrow stretching bright and endless before you. This was one of those times.